as a part of the GlobSec. This year, we try to contribute to the greener color of the whole event. Let's hope we will manage. First, the panel starts with introductory speech of His Excellency Mr. László Sojmos, Minister of Environment of the Slovak Republic, and after that we will start the panel discussion. Minister, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. We live in a dynamic world that is no longer black and white. In a world where next to security, political, economic, or social topics, there are questions having their irreplaceable position, which will fundamentally affect our world, our institutions, and our everyday life over the course of a few years. Extreme weather events, enormous droughts, problems with drinking water on one hand, increasingly frequent torrential rains, floods, and landslides on the other. Even in areas where they did not occur or are not natural in the environment. We speak openly about climate change, which is a reality, and we must act before it is too late. At the global level, an important document was adopted in the area of decarbonization, the Paris Climate Agreement. It is the agreement that aims to limit the growth of a global temperature by the end of the century to a maximum 2 degrees Celsius, and if possible, significantly below that value to only 1.5 degrees Celsius compared to the pre-industrial period. In Slovakia too, we have to take successive steps in different sectors to keep global warming below 2 degrees Celsius. And we are indeed taking concrete measures. The Paris Climate Agreement came into force in 2016, which was also one of the results of the Slovak presidency in the Council of the European Union. Finally, on 7th of October in 2016, I personally handed the instruments of ratification for the European Union and Slovakia to the United Nations depositories in New York. That is also why I feel the Paris Climate Agreement personally. We are very well aware the thoughtless use of natural resources is the way to extinction. The rational use of natural resources based on a respect for the environment and the social aspects of development is an alpha and omega of an innovative type of economy, the circular economy. It is a challenge that the whole world is facing. We will have to respond to it and accept it. That is also why I'm glad that at the Ministry of the Environment we have created a platform for mutual exchange of information and experience in support of a transition to the circular, the green economy, with the involvement of all relevant subjects of society in the conditions of the Slovak Republic. The very important international conference called the Transition to the Green Economy, with a prominent participation, was prepared within the Slovak presidency in the Council of the European Union. This step is a clear message that we perceive the transition to green economy in a wider context than just through the decarbonization prism. We consider to circular economy the concept of effective use of resources and the concept of waste as a product is a way to sustainability as the key areas. For the Central and the Eastern European countries with limited natural resources, the green economy is an important manufacturing sector that returns produced and already used products back into circulation. Otherwise, they would end up in landfills or incinerators without further use. It is important that manufacturing companies that are already applying the elements of the circular economy would be willing to share and communicate their experiences with this innovative way of production. It is in the automotive industry, which is a driving force in the Slovak economy, where exists a great deal of room for swift handling of limited natural resources and for an introduction of new innovative approaches in the production of automobiles and the components. Ladies and gentlemen, in order to achieve great things, we need to sit down to one table and move step by step, discuss openly and constructively, exchange opinions, and seek common effective solutions. And it is this new partnership with the GlobSec Security Forum that opens new horizons to all of us. We perceive it very positively because it allows youth to exchange experiences at an international level and look for more direct ways of solving problems. I am convinced that we will utilize all this new knowledge in the preparation of strategic documents on which we are intensively working at the Ministry of Environment. Whether it is the new environmental policy strategy of the Slovak Republic until 2030, which sets up system solutions for the biggest environmental challenges of Slovakia, such as air quality, waste, and forests, as well as in preparation of the low-carbon strategy in which we cooperate with the World Bank. Dear ladies and gentlemen, combating the effects of climate change requires a common commitment from all institutions at all levels of government and the society. Not only in our country, but also at the regional and international level, respectively. Therefore, I am personally very pleased that also through this forum we have an opportunity to discuss important environmental issues that affect our future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Minister. Yes, indeed, climate change and low carbon strategy and sustainable development cannot go one without each other, so, and may innovation help us with this. With that, I would like thank the Minister, and I have to apologize for him not to be able to be with us for the whole panel because of other duties. He has to leave, but anyway, thank you for the introductory remarks. Now I would like to invite panelists to the floor, to the podium. Thank you very much. First, let me introduce our panelists. First, I would like to introduce Mr. Artur Runge-Metzger, who is the director at the DG Climate Action at the European Commission. Then Mr. Norbert Kurila, a State Secretary for the Ministry of Environment of the Slovak Republic. Mr. Klaus Fodinger, Managing Director and Chairman of the Board of CRG Slovakia. Sorry, CRH. I'm still somewhere in your old name. And Mr. Lukáš Kuzmiak, Principal Banker from the EBRD Slovakia. We've heard in the speech of Minister that Paris Agreement adopted actually 2.5 years ago sets a very ambitious goal to keep the rise of the temperature somewhere well below 2 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. Well, with current policies and measures and current ways of living, we are somewhere between 3 and 4 degrees, and it means that the work ahead of us is very, very difficult. The truth is also that without innovation and better use of technology, whether existing or new, we are not likely to reach this target. So the question is whether we need some supporting policies from the government side to motivate both business, academia, and research to develop policies to the right way. And this we would like to discuss through this panel. First, let me ask Mr. Arthur Runge-Metzger to give us some European perspective. Firstly, very shortly, how do you see the state of play of the Paris Agreement negotiations? Will we get to some tangible results by the end of this year? And also, where do you see the main challenges and in terms of innovation and technologies when it comes to Framework 2030? And maybe later we can come to some other issues. Arthur, you have the floor.
No, thank you very much for inviting me. And maybe just one remark before I start is I think it's very timely and very good to link security with climate change, because there's so many implications we are going to have if we really would move into a 3 or 4 degrees world. I think even a 2 degrees world that is around the corner by 2050, if we move forward in the coming years, will have major security implications, and particularly for Europe. Just look south of Europe in terms of what is going to happen with climate change and what the pressure is going to be on the European continent if all of that is going to happen. So I think it is very timely. So therefore, Paris implementation is paramount. And I think the minister said that he was depositing the instrument of ratification, and it has entered into force. So it's really now for us to deliver on our promises. And I think in Europe we are in a very good place, because we have been marching forward since December 2015, since we have all agreed and applauded to the Paris Agreement in order to implement our promise. And the first promise from Europe is to get our emissions down by at least 40% by the year 2030. And I think I can report last Monday, the Council in Brussels was voting, and the last pieces of legislation were done in order to secure that implementation in Europe. So Europe, 2 years after Paris, has firmly put this into European legislation. So this is now going to be the challenge for industry, for the private people, in order to move forward. And I think that is what the next step is also at the level of the member states, to make sure how can we really get there. And a lot has to do with the investments that are going to be required, but they are linked to these technologies that we need. Until 2030, at least if we look at what we have available today, we can do that. The technologies are known, whether it is renewable energy, solar or wind or geothermal, it is there. If it comes to better cars, they are being produced right now in Slovakia, and they will get better over time. So we don't think that in terms of new technologies, you need to have a big breakthrough until 2030. Everything is there. It's now a matter of political will to really move forward in the coming years. But when it comes to the longer term, then we get to some of the very difficult issues. And this morning in one of the conversations, cement was mentioned. Cement production, process emissions, how are we going to get them down? Can you produce steel without having any emissions? Yes, we can have, because in the laboratory, we have already found ways of capturing the CO2 from the cement production, and we have found ways to produce steel without using coal. But it hasn't been tested at large scale. And I think that is the big task for the coming 10 years, to make sure that we have some good examples on these big process technologies that we require in the longer term to move forward.
Thank you very much. Well, let's hope that actually we see now that the innovation and technology cycle now is much quicker than 100 years ago. So there is still hope we can come up with some usable and scalable technologies. Now let me turn to Norbert. Norbert, I know that the transition towards green economy is very close to your heart, and also climate change, I hope. And can you give us some ideas how policies could direct the community towards desirable pathway, including support of innovation and technologies?
Thank you, and good morning to everybody. Before I reply to your question, I would say that the climate change and green economy is one thing. So I would not differentiate between those two. I think they're matching, and we need to pursue them and push forward simultaneously. I would also like to say that it all started very concretely, for example, in my country, during the Slovak presidency. We created the platform that has successfully been integrated into GlobeSec. It's called, we use acronyms, so it's called T2GE, Transition to Green Economy, and I'm also very proud that we can be here today in this fashion, and having also audience with us, which is very good. So it all started in 2016, having this Bratislava Green Economy process going on, and through that we were also very privileged to manage the EU affairs at that time on behalf of the member states in the council. And I may also add that it was not only about depositing ratification instruments in New York, but it's also about making it happen. And this was something that even in our planning exercise, when we planned for the presidency, we did not count on extraordinary Environment Ministers' Council that was held on 30th September. And there were very little optimism around that we can manage the process through unanimous support. But we managed, luckily, and therefore the Paris Climate Agreement could enter into force on the 4th of November. So I think we contributed heavily to the existence of Paris Agreement, but perhaps not so many people know. So I wanted to echo it a little bit in more depth. So we are very proud of it, but now it's time for implementation. We're trying to do our homework, and we started quite expeditiously, especially with our strategic approach, especially having a very long-term vision going to 2050, and we are now working with the World Bank to get the most cost-effective options, how to decarbonize our economy while staying competitive. So now we are working on this, and we are able to deliver a study already in September. By September this year, we're working already for one and a half year on this, and we are happy to showcase results already in September. We are also working on environment strategy that tackles both issue of sustainability in wider sense and climate action. And we have also luckily established analytical unit within the Ministry of Environment, Institute for Environmental Policy, that help us identifying good policy options by providing good analysis, good research, and good information to take a good decision. So with all this, I think we could be on the good pathways, but it's also fair to say, having, let's say, cement industry in this panel, but also many others, Slovakia is a very industrialized country with lots of share for energy-intensive industries, and it's also fair to say that if the breakthrough technologies are not rolling out at the pace we wish to, there will be also losers. And one of the sectors, it will be also automotive sector in Slovakia, because the cars we are producing today are not going to be produced tomorrow. So we have to be mindful of that there are opportunities, but also there are some threats, and we need to address them accordingly.
Thank you very much, Norbert. We've heard from EU perspective something about the national level. But when it comes to implementation, it's you guys from business and industry who have to keep their promises and plans. So how do you see the role of innovation and technologies, and how for instance, cement industry is going to be prepared for low carbon development? Thank you.
Yes, first of all, thank you for inviting me and representing the cement industry on this panel. Yes, I'm coming from the industry. I'm from the cement industry. Cement industry is, through its production process, emitting CO2. This is a given thing out of the production process. We are consuming limestone, we are burning limestone, and we are burning limestone with the use of fossil fuel, and these two components emit CO2. But cement is a product which our world needs, our people need. We need to build cities, we need to build houses, so it's a product which is necessary for further development of our country, of our planet. Cement is, in terms of mass, the mostly produced product in the world, and in terms of substance, the second biggest after water in terms of consumption. So it has a really, really high rate of consumption and of value for the globe. Coming to your question, yes, through this production process, cement industry is emitting CO2, but cement industry is taking a lot of efforts in the past years to improve its carbon footprint, and there are three ways to do that. The first is subsidizing limestone by alternative raw materials. The second one is subsidizing fossil fuels by alternative fuels, and the third one is energy efficiency. And if it comes to CRH, the company I'm working for, and CRH is a global player and one of the biggest cement producers in the world, they reduced their carbon footprint since 1990 by almost 25%. So there are a lot of investments done, a lot of efforts, a lot of progress. If I come down to the local environment, to Slovakia, we are operating 2 cement plants. We invested in the last 5 years 40 million euros into technologies to optimize the carbon footprint. We invested into a hot disk, which allows us substitution rate up to 80%. So we are not using fossil fuels like gas, like oil, but we use processed alternative fuel, which comes from waste. This waste otherwise should have been landfilled, and this waste also contains biomass, and biomass is CO2 neutral. We are industrial leader in the region on that. The automotive industry was mentioned, but I think it's also worth to mention our industry here, our cement plant close to Bratislava, where we have this outstanding technology, where we are best in class in the region, and where we have every month plenty of visits from industrial players just to look at what technologies we are operating. Our second cement plant in the east of Slovakia, near Košice, also we are subsidizing limestone by slag. Slag is a byproduct out of the steel industry, so we are subsidizing up to 30% of limestone by slag, which is almost CO2 neutral. So I think there are a lot of efforts done. We know this is not the end of the road, this is not the end of the story. We look further into it, we will invest further money and efforts into improving, but we need also a support, we need a financial support, and we need also a fair treatment in terms of ETS, in terms of emission trading systems, where the cement industry is facing more and more imbalance with countries not underlying these emission trade systems.
Thank you very much. We heard that there are already some new or progressive technologies, but there is and there will be a need for some more. And the question is, who will pay for it? Where the money comes from? Do you have some in the pocket, Lukáš? Can you tell us something about the ways how to improve climate finance, or whether there are some innovative ways to finding financial sources needed?
First of all, thank you very much for inviting me to this event, and it's very good to see that topic of transition to green economy is getting the visibility it deserves. I'm also glad to be here because green in general is very close to EBRD heart, and answering your question where the money comes from, I think there is enough money around to finance all these initiatives and even the most innovative projects. I think the one thing that needs to change, and this is mainly probably for the commercial banks, is the perception of projects that focus on green investments. I think what needs to change is this needs to become very much a business as usual kind of thing, as it is, for example, for EBRD. In many cases, in projects that we finance, the perception is that the green element is more of a risk, while we at EBRD see it as an opportunity. And that's why we are happy to support these projects. Green, in general, has been part of EBRD business delivery and mandates since early 90s and developed into what we call now Green Economy Transition Approach, which was formulated in 2015. And we actually imposed a target on ourselves as well on the back of the Paris Agreement, where we said that 40% of the business that we do annually will be into green projects. We actually managed to reach this target last year when we hit 43%. Just to give it a bit of a perspective, that's 4 billion euros in green economy projects just by EBRD. A bit bigger picture, since 2006, so that's close to 12 years, we financed close to 27 billion worth of EBRD finance going to projects with overall value close to 130 billion euros in green economy. In terms of the more innovative structures, I think there are already a lot of them available. We try to be part of them, as many as possible. We see green bonds sort of getting more and more visibility. We have invested into first one in Baltics with Lithuanian Energy. We have invested into the largest green bond fund in the world, together with IFC and EIB. So I think there are other fintech opportunities, very different structures. One important point with respect to green projects in general is you need to try and tailor your solutions, because there are very different needs and responsibilities of different stakeholders, and they have different sort of payback opportunities or means. So you need to be careful who you offer what type of product. But I think there are products on the market for everyone.
Thank you very much. This sounds pretty encouraging, and some impressive figures we heard as well. I would like also now to open the floor for intervention from the audience. If you have any questions, remark, notes, please do not hesitate to take the floor. We would like to keep the discussion very informal, so if you feel you can interrupt the speakers, no problems there. They will not take this as an offense, I hope. And but given the time constraints, please keep your intervention short and concise, so that everyone who wants to have a floor can get the floor. And no, if not, yes?
I wanted actually to announce and mention it in the beginning. We have, when I mentioned the launching of this platform, we had a very crucial partner with us. It's called Pedal Consulting, and I see one of the representatives here today with us, because thanks to them we were able to get some funding from Horizon 2020 envelope. And I'm sure there are some good examples, and we did not tackle it at this stage. And especially the bioeconomy as part of circular economy is also a driver for innovations, is also a driver to get also this sector right. And I think we have registered already one speaker who would like to introduce a BioVoices project. And at the same time, if I may jump into your role, I understand that we have also biofuels industry present with us who would like to contribute. But without prejudice, I didn't want to invite them personally, but feel free to make your statements now.
But I can, I think. So, Mr. Spisak, can I ask you to take the floor and to say a few words about new biotechnologies. There is a mic coming. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Robert Spišák. I'm coming from a company NVN, which is the leading biofuel producer here in the European region, so having production facilities in Slovakia, Hungary, Czech Republic, and Croatia. So we all know, and I think it does not worth to spend the time with explanation that the transportation contributes to the huge part of the CO2 emission all around the world, and especially in Europe. And in the last almost 15 years, we as an industry contributed with biofuels a lot to the greenhouse gas reduction. So it's thanks to industry players, it's thanks to the bank which are financing these projects, and I can support that, yes, having a feasible project, there is money on the market which is available for that. But this type of the business is really kind of regulation-driven or policy-driven business. And what's the most important for this business is really to have a stable regulation. So now, as many of you know, there are ongoing discussion on EC level on so-called RED II directive, Renewable Energy Directive, which is trying to support the so-called advanced biofuels, so produced from the raw material which is not competing with food and other agri-products. They are projects, including ours, which are ready to be implemented. These are huge investments. For instance, in our case, it's almost 180 million euros, which is able to be financed from the market based on the market conditions. But what's really an important issue is to have a policy for that and regulation about that. So thanks to the Slovak government, I have to say thank you. There is a regulation here in Slovakia which is encouraging this type of investment, and now we are waiting for something similar in EC level, where these discussions are ongoing. And so I would like to ask maybe the other panelists as well, especially from, let's say, the policy part of the panel, how they can see this, let's say, outcome of the discussion, and whether they share my view that to have a stable regulatory framework for longer period than 5-10 years is a crucial thing, not only for biofuels, but for the whole green economy to be developed, because it's simply an inevitable part of all the business cases, financial models, private decision-making procedures, and even long-term policy strategies. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. This is quite encouraging, I believe, to hear some feedback from the people who are really in the business and how they see the policy. And before giving the floor to panelists to respond to the question, there was another question there. First, this one.
Thank you,
Yeah.
thank you. Mr. Kurila already introduced me partly. I'm Martin Vlachinský. Some of you may know me more than as an economic analyst, but here I'm attending this event because I'm participating in the project which was mentioned, which is called BioVoices. And this project is focused on enhancing mutual learning of the key stakeholders. What does it mean? The already several times mentioned conference in 2016 was kind of a founding stone in a new way of discussion where the various views on the impacts of green transition to green economy and this project, especially bioproducts, was offered because, for example, in terms of bioproducts, we know the conflict between the use of food commodities for food or for industrial use. So there are often conflicting outcomes. And we are hoping to bring together 4 key stakeholders, which is the researchers, business, policymakers, and the consumers, to engage together to offer their often different views on the problematics and to identify the real challenges, real problems, and try to find solutions. The consortium has 13 partners from 10 member states, And the main activity is organizing workshops in the member states and also international workshops. And each of these workshops will include all four the stakeholder groups. And the outcomes of the workshop, these discussions, will be placed on online portal, BioVoices. So if you are interested in this kind of discussion from various point of views, also from, let's say, consumers, because these are not so often heard, or business, then feel free to follow the website, the social media, and there's a good chance one of these workshops will also be happening in your member state or nearby, so you are very welcome to attend. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Blachinski. That's very good to hear about these new approaches, and I believe you will have shortly other followers in this new direction. Now I would like to turn to panel to respond to the question about the stability of regulatory framework.
Okay, maybe I start on this one. We think from the side of the Commission that it is absolutely essential to have a stable regulatory framework. And to be honest, if you look back over the last years and if you look at renewables, I don't think that we had a stable framework in Europe, because what we have seen is in quite a number of member states that the policies were changing. Because I think one thing is that many member states were surprised about the success of the renewables and that they completely underestimated the amount of money it would cost if it becomes a big undertaking. And therefore, we saw a lot of sudden changes in some of the member states, even reverting supporting schemes that were put out in the past. And that, of course, is upsetting the industry, it's upsetting the financial sector, because then all the loans you give become somehow obsolete. And what has happened, particularly in the biofuels industry, is that a lot of the planned investments were stopped. And from our side, we have a big innovation fund called NER 300, where money comes from the emissions trading system. A lot of projects were awarded money, but many of those projects didn't come through. And it was particularly in the biofuels area. And the response is very simple, because there is no stable framework. And the framework we have at the present is going until the year 2020. So the RED II proposal is there to at least expand that to the year 2030, and also to give a very strong signal to the more advanced biofuels. These are the ones that are the most expensive ones, and they will require significant support, otherwise it's not going to happen. That is very clear, and that is the gist of the Commission proposal that is there. That has raised a lot of concerns of the incumbent biofuels industry, saying, but we still also need some support. We cannot yet stand on our own legs. And I think this is being discussed at the moment in the Parliament and the Council. I think yesterday, again, there was a trilogue among the different institutions to see that there can be also a way forward for the ones who have been investing, so that at least we can say they can continue with their business into the future. But if you look at the longer term, it is the advanced biofuels that are going to make the big change. And that requires specific effort, and that we need to get ready now in order to give predictability at least until the year 2030.
Thank you, Norbert.
Maybe from the national perspective, also a quick reflection. We are very much aligned in thinking that we need a clear, predictable and stable framework. Unfortunately, especially for the biofuels business, perhaps it was not the case, but nationally I think we're trying to keep the promises and try to deliver on our targets set for 2020. What strikes me a little bit, and I find it a bit unfortunate, that we, even having a new clean mobility package, for example, on the table, we miss a long-term target for let's say second generation or advanced biofuels for 2030. I think this is a little bit This creates already a little bit uncertainty, what's going to happen next, but I would definitely concur with Arthur that we need those investments, so I would encourage you to continue your reflections on further investing into advanced biofuels technologies. I see a great potential for them to be used not only in the region but beyond. And as we were speaking in one of the sessions yesterday, when it comes to the transport, to the automotive and to the automotive sector and to the transportations per se, we clearly opt for technologically neutral approach. So we don't want to pick the winner already today. There is a big push for e-mobility. It's well noted, but from the policy maker side, we don't want to pick e-mobility as a winner already now. I think we want to create enabling framework to compete with all available technologies. And then perhaps at a later stage, we will see which one is the most progressive, most promising, and provided that it also is sustainable.
Thank you. You mentioned that you missed the target for biofuels. You mean on a European level? And if yes, do you think it would have some sense to set some on the national level?
I think it would, especially for the business operations and especially for the investments decisions that are being made now for, let's say, 10 years' time ahead. Because those investments in the first generation, for example, they've been heavily invested in, let's say, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, and are now planned to be amortized by 2020 at least. So I think, and even beyond. So I think the industry would desire to have targets, but we need to get it right in order not to modify it in half-time, as we were trying to do it maybe in the past.
I believe there are a couple of people in this room who will follow the development in setting national targets, probably, in the near future, but we will see. Before giving the floor for other panelists, there are some other questions from the floor. First, that one guy, 1, 3, 4, 5th floor row.
Yeah, hello everyone, my name is Dominik Hatjar. I'm participating in the Young Leaders program of Globsec, and I formerly worked in the cabinet of Mr. Šefčovič and now working with Statoil in Brussels. We really, 2050, we should be getting to zero emissions, zero carbon. And that means, addressing the emissions of all these sectors, and especially being in this region, a heavily industrialized region. How do we address the energy-intensive sectors? And so far we have the CCS solution and the hydrogen solution. And coming from Norway, I sort of represent a company that is trying to present or develop new projects in this area. So what we, for instance, have is a project connecting an industrial cluster in Netherlands and in the UK, and transporting the CO2 emissions from those major industries into Norway, where we would store the CO2. And this, just yesterday, the Norwegian government announced a major financing of this project, another 8 million, and we hope to make a final investment decision in 2020. And it's these kind of projects that should be happening more often. And what kind of regulatory frameworks or supportive mechanisms would you envision at EU level? Should be the Innovation Fund, which is money just coming from the EU ETS revenues financing this. And to Mr. Kurila, perhaps, how does this region view the decarbonization of its industries? Do you have strategies? Would CCS or hydrogen ever be a solution that you're looking at? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We will take another question. Lady here in the third row. Thank you.
Sara Stefanini. I'm a freelance journalist focused on energy and climate. Looking more internationally at the Bonn talks just a few weeks ago, I mean, finance still has always been and remains the big divide between the developed and developing world, especially with Washington withholding money from the Green Climate Fund. I wonder, I mean, there's a lot of talk about investment and creating more sustainable investment, and you get a lot of summits where cities and non-state actors are talking about this. But especially the EU, what's its responsibility in providing also investment and technology transfer? And other encouragement to the developing world? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would like first to turn to Klaus. How to address energy-intensive sectors? There was a question. You mentioned at the beginning that you already have some very new and modern technologies, but how do you see this possibility to go to zero emissions?
Yes, as I mentioned, the industry is working now in three fields. It's the energy efficiency, it's a substitution of fossil fuel by alternative fuels, and it's a substitution of clinker, which is a semi-product, by alternative products like slag, fly ash, and so on. Yeah? There are developed countries, yeah, like our neighboring country, Austria, and so on, and they come already to a CO2 emission equivalent of 500 kilo. Here in Slovakia, we still have 650 to 700 kilo, but there are countries also from 8 to 900. So the first step would be to bring all these countries which are still on 8, 900 to 500 minimum. Yeah? But then there is a natural barrier, because you cannot go lower because you exceed all your possibilities you have out of your technology. Okay, you can burn 100% alternative fuels, but it's not 100% biomass. It's just not available in the market. It's processed waste, so you have plastics, you have household waste, and so on. So you can do it, but this is the natural limit. The same is for raw materials, which you subsidize the limestone. Here you have to have the availability of alternative raw materials like slag and fly ash. It depends in which location your industry is. And the cement industry is a very local industry with high logistic costs. You can transport all these products hundreds of kilometers, so you have to have it close to you. So it depends where you are and what are your neighboring industries where you can source alternative raw materials. The third is energy efficiency. Yes, you can come down with your energy input, but again, there's a certain limit. So what we see, or the industry sees, up to 2050, where also the industry is committed to reduce at the maximum, I'm not saying to zero, but to a maximum, and the master plan says now the industry is emitting 2.3 billion tons of CO2 globally, with the production of 4 billion tons of cement. It's foreseen that up to 2050 the cement production will increase to 5 billions, and also, of course, the CO2 emissions would increase accordingly. But our industry is committed as a first step to reduce it from 2.3 to 1.7 billions. This is only possible to 50% with the three inputs which I just explained. To come to really that level close to zero, it needs alternative innovations. You need to invest into carbon capturing investments, and this is quite a long way to go. It started off. There are testing plants in innovation technologies just started. There's a plant in Texas, as far as I know, where they try to capture the carbon. There are testing facilities installed already where they even try to produce food, baking powder out of CO2, where they produce gases which can be used as a fuel again in transport industry, etc. So there are a lot of things going on, but we know also that to develop these alternative mechanisms, there will be 2 to 3 billions needed of research and developments to come there, and that's what I'm saying. We are committed, we are going there, we have a goal, but we need financial support to put all this in place and to finance the research and development on that.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's true that on the way towards low carbon or carbon neutral or even zero carbon economy, there are some natural barriers like technology emissions or so. But there are the ways we've heard carbon capture and storage or increase things and so on. Let's focus on carbon capture and storage. It's known technologies for years, but it's extremely expensive. And as you mentioned, there is a need for quite a lot of money in investment to be invested in research and development. Lukáš, you mentioned that there are money around. Could you maybe clarify some ways whether the EBRD can be involved in financing research and development, for instance? Or investing in carbon capture and storage as a pretty risky project?
I think the simple answer is yes. However, there is a big but, and I would maybe like to come back to the regulation and stability of the regulation. It's clear that a lot of these new technologies and the first comers are perceived as very risky investments by the finance world. And banks generally look at regulatory risk as something they don't really like because it's something completely out of their, or usually even the investors' control. And since these investments are very expensive, they take a lot of time to repay, to actually return the investment. So stable regulatory environment not only helps the investors to understand how the market will look like 10, 15 years down the road, but also banks to get some comfort in the fact that there won't be any surprises 5, 6, 7 years down the road, because these investments take much longer than that to repay. Coming to your question whether EBRD can finance and what the big but is, I think that's we are happy to be supporters of the pilot projects and the newcomers and the best available technology. However, I think that there is a role for the government and for EU to play and support these investments by some form of concessional financing, if not to make this project bankable, but at least to motivate and incentivize the private investors to look at the investments and consider them. The way we try to approach this issue is usually to attach R&D, which is usually in sort of smaller amount of money on a bigger capex project. And then it's sometimes easier for the companies to decide to go for these sort of investments, which are pure cost-based, and there is no necessary immediate return. And this is the part where governments and other donors can support.
Thank you. And this nicely bridges to another question, maybe on finance and with this new, well, how to say it correctly, geopolitical situation with US not contributing to the Green Climate Fund. Actually, Green Climate Fund might be one of the sources for this type of investment, but again, it has its several great buts as well, but we will not dwell on it. Arthur, could you say a few words how EU can play the role in financing this gap, especially in providing climate finance and the technology transfer for developing countries?
Okay, maybe before I go on to that, I'll still want to talk about EU climate finance in the EU. Because what is very clear on that we need to look at the time frame. When do we need certain technologies in order to go down the decarbonization pathway? And I think Norbert said it in the beginning. He said we need to look that this is a cost-efficient pathway. That doesn't mean that all the things we can dream of today we need to put in place tomorrow. But what we should be doing is start with the cheap stuff first, and I think industry is doing that, and I think we have heard that from the cement industry, why that is possible. And I think we know somehow what needs to be done until the year 2030. And where we really need big investment until the year 2030, and nobody has been speaking about that, is buildings. In the buildings and energy efficiency, that is, I wouldn't say it's a low-hanging fruit. It costs you something, but it is somehow neglected. We did the analysis until 2030, saying how much money do we need in addition to what people are going to invest anyway. And you know, in Europe, it's about 20% of GDP that we are investing every year into our economy. into new houses, factories, replacement of the transport system, and so on. And we only need, I think, 1.2% more in order to get to the CO2 right pathway. But of that money, 75% will have to go into buildings. So when, for instance, you are doing your plan for the year 2030, you will have to come up with an answer and say, okay, what are we going to do to encourage investments in buildings? We should not only start always by saying, look at the very expensive end, the CCS. The CCS works in Norway because Norway has a tax on carbon, which is 50 euros per ton of carbon dioxide. Today's price of CO2 in the Union is 15 euros. So with that, you're not going to get a CCS project going. There needs to be some investment into research, and we will do that with the innovation fund that we are creating now in Europe. And CCS, or the use of carbon in the industrial process, is something that we are going to invest money into in order to see what is really the potential there. But it's not the big rollout. That comes after 2030, and that is for the longer term. You need much higher carbon prices in order to support that. And that's also true for the synthetic biofuels or the advanced ones. You need a much higher price for carbon in order to move forward. Now come the technology transfer. Technology transfer, that is a business case for Europe. If we are investing in those technologies, then of course we would like to see them disseminated around the world. And Europe is doing well on that. If you look at green technologies, I think one of the best examples is wastewater treatment. How much have we done in Europe first to clean up our own wastewater and to treat our water to have clean drinking water? And we are, I think, the main exporter of that technology globally. Everywhere this technology goes, it's a real business case for Europe. And we can repeat that story in many other areas. The automotive industry has been mentioned. And it's clear that our competitors around the world are not waiting for the EU to make the first step. I was in China in January at a big electric vehicle conference. There, it's very clear. This is a strategic objective of the Chinese government. In China, many more million cars will be sold than in Europe because the market is not twice the size because there's twice as many people, but there's also many less people who have cars today. So that is where the big investment is going. And if the Chinese government wants to go electric and wants to push that forward, then this is something that is going to affect the competitiveness of the car manufacturers in Europe. If they don't want your internal combustion engine in China, if you want to be a player in the Chinese market, please think of your strategy, what needs to be done in the coming years. What does it mean for climate finance and helping our friends in the developing world? Very clearly, it requires some finance in the developing countries to move into the right direction. It doesn't mean that now Europe is going to pay for everybody's investment around the world, but it's to make sure that we push it, get it over the hurdle. That is what is happening. And from our end, if you look at the numbers, there is the 100 billion commitment that still comes from Copenhagen. I think we are going in the right direction in Europe. We are the major funder in this area. What is happening internationally is that the United States doesn't want to pay any longer. I don't think that the EU must now pick up that bill immediately. We will have to think of, okay, what can we do in order to make our contribution even more effective? Because also it doesn't mean that we have to give everything as a grant. We have our institutions here who sometimes with a risk guarantee you can trigger funding. And that lever that you have there, that is very helpful. The NER 300 was mentioned, And I have another example. That's an energy efficiency fund we do with the European Investment Bank. We have a leverage factor of 1 to 12, which means €1 is coming from the EU and 12 euros is coming from the private sector. But without that one single euro from the EU, it would not happen. But the leverage is enormous that you have. And that leverage is something we will have to look at with developing countries. It's not to foot the bill in developing countries entirely. If you look today, China's money that goes into developing countries is much, much bigger. What is important is that that money supports green investment. And that's also where we can maybe help with a little money from our end to make sure that the Chinese money doesn't go into outdated coal plants, but it goes into the better technologies. So I think that is something where we have to be smart and clever in Europe on how we do our investments.
Thank you, Arthur. I believe Klaus listened very carefully, especially when you mentioned that Innovation Fund would be ready to finance some research and development in the new technologies. And I hope that we will see some, again, innovative project in CRH factory near Bratislava. Are there any further? Please, we have a question here in the first row.
Thank you, Jacques de Jong, Klingendahl Energy Netherlands. I just want to pick up further on the price of carbon, if I may, and not so much in the context of CCS and hydrogen, because we are very closely involved in what is happening in the North Sea, etc. But risk management and investor confidence, that is what we need. And the price of carbon is playing a role in that context. Now, it is a little bit too easy to say, well, it is impossible in the ETS context to do something on the price of carbon. And there are possibilities also at regional levels to do more on that. And let's say some kind of a guarantee for maybe a minimum price or a maximum price of carbon can play a role. And then via systems like contracts for differences, for 10 to 15 years, you can give enhanced investor confidence. And I'm happy to hear, let's say, that the EBRD is open and willing to look at innovative, risk-managing devices for all these kind of things. And with your leverage factor of 1 to 12, let's say, with a little help of the friends of the European Commission, you can make a lot of differences.
Lukáš, would you like to comment?
I can only agree with what was said, that the leverage effect and how much you can do with very little grant money or concessional financing or risk mitigating instruments is impressive. And maybe I would like to advocate more efficient use of these sources. Because while banks, they do have a lot of money, and I don't think that's the problem, grants are not unlimited. And we are all waiting for what will ultimately happen beyond 2020 with the structural funds. So I think the money that we have, and Slovakia has been one of the highest benefactors of those money, we have to be careful what we do with them. And we have to think, years forward and make sure that we, in the time that we have, try to develop a sustainable market and not a distorted market. Because we often see companies or maybe sort of sovereign municipalities fully relying on those money, even in investments where we believe there is a source for repayment, there is a proper cash flow that can service debt. And there we are talking about the leverage effect. And 1 to 12 is an impressive number. So if we could work with those kind of numbers, that would be, I think the results would be much better than what we have.
Thank you. I think Norbert, you wanted to react?
Yes, but I think there was a question before. I would like to go from global to local environment. But I think it was not meant to mention 1 to 12 to say that EIB is better than EBRD. It was, I think, there are good opportunities that could be explored with your institution as well. But I want to go local, and where we see our energy-intensive industries by 2050, and how our climate action could push further investments and decarbonization that is needed, but also modernization, because as you rightfully know, it's kind of an industrial revolution in a way. Okay, we call it perhaps with different words, but it is. And for Slovakia, I think we will have fully decarbonized energy sector, which represents roughly 50% of total GHG emissions already in a very near future, thanks to the nuclear. Nuclear is considered as a zero emission source. Of course, it has its implications, but anyhow, from the CO2 perspectives, nuclear is part of solution. And through the uptake of the nuclear energy, I think we will be decarbonized fairly soon, and I would guess by 2025, which is, that's my personal estimate. Also having in mind the closure or phased out of coal that is now happening Upper Nitra region. And Slovakia is one of the pilot country in the projects for how do you call it, traditional coal regions in transitions, and Slovakia is part of it already at this stage. So it gives me more comfort to think that the energy will be decarbonized soon. For the industry side, I see more challenges, especially for the energy intensive, because as the breakthrough innovations are not already at hand, and they are planned to be at hand later, there will be still some emissions around, provided that there are no available technologies that could capture those CO2, for example. But I see more merits not to focus exclusively on CCS, as perhaps Norwegian government and Norwegian companies, including Statoil, does, and others. But I would also look at the opportunity on CCU, which is called carbon capture and utilization, as we can use from the process emissions, and we can use from other parts of emissions the CO2 and use it as a byproduct or as a product to develop new products. So I think this is a great opportunity. From the NER 300, I think none of the CCS projects was funded at the end of the day. It was only one in play, unfortunately. It was not funded. But I think through the new funds that are created by the emission trading scheme, Arthur mentioned Innovation Fund. Let's look at this. If CCU projects could be eligible, could be available. But also we have a modernization fund, and it's especially for our region, for Slovakia, to benefit and to modernize through energy efficiency the operations in businesses like cement industry, like steel industry, and many others that are present in Slovakia. And we need to make the best benefit of these funds. They are exclusive. Okay, it's a fair. We need to economically converge. So I think it's a right decision, and let's hope we will make some benefits of it.
Thank you. This brings me very nicely to what I wanted to ask all panelists, and this is we talk about the current policies. We talk about 2030 framework, but what about long-term strategies? And do you see, let's say, Slovakia as a carbon neutral or zero carbon country after 2050? Or I know that EU is in the stage of preparing its low carbon or climate strategy. So maybe if it is not premature, Arthur, you may say a few words where it will be framed. And also the question for industry, given the barriers which exist in mass balance and chemistry, do you see possibility to be in a company or to be in a society which is carbon neutral? And could the EBRD or banking sector contribute to that through, let's say, financing carbon capture and usage as a perspective, innovative technology? So we will start with Arthur.
I think in the beginning I mentioned that last Monday the Council voted the last pieces of legislation through. So if we, and that sets the targets until 2030, if that legislation continues to be there, we will get to minus 80% in the year 2050. So that is still some way away from being carbon neutral. So the next exercise we are going to do is to look at, okay, how could we get even deeper in the year 2050? And since we did our exercise last time about 7, 8 years ago, a lot of things have changed. One thing that has changed is that renewable energy has become so much cheaper in the whole system, and that other processes are becoming interesting, like the carbon utilization was mentioned, but also, for instance, the use of hydrogen in the economy, and then the whole use of the biomaterials. So whether it is for fuels or whether it is even for the chemical sector. And there's new ways that we can start coupling the different sectors, industrial sectors, but also with agriculture and forestry. And that is something that we need to explore in our next exercise in order to see how far are we going to get. And one area that we kind of was always a little bit the orphan in this context was agriculture and forestry. Because when we talk about carbon neutrality, it doesn't mean that there is going to be no emissions at the end of the day, but the Paris Agreement clearly says there needs to be a balance. The remaining emissions that you might have will have to be balanced with things that remove. And one technology was mentioned here, carbon capture and storage. The other technology that is there is millennia old, is you use your vegetation in order to capture carbon and keep it there in the standing stocks of forests, and then you can use this so-called harvested wood products and keep that in circulation where the sea is being captured in a form that it's not moving up to the air. So that is something that we will have to explore in more detail. Again, this is not going to lead to a final decision on how the world is going to look like by the end of November this year, but this is only going to start a new dialogue process, a new discussion with all the stakeholders around the table, whether it is industry, whether it is the different governments, whether it's the finance sector, whether it is civil society, to really explore how far can we go and what can we as Europeans commit to in the future, what we can contribute to that battle against climate change, which everybody knows we will have to win.
Thank you. Norbert, Slovakia is pretty covered by forests which create a large, well, usually large thing to help us with our emissions. Do you think that they may offset the remaining technology emissions, or does Slovakia has potential to become a zero carbon country?
I would be optimistic, of course, given the fact that we have a proper forest management and good practices. I'm sure we can be even better, but it's very hard to say at this stage, not knowing what really comes out in 10 years' time and what kind of technologies we would have at our hand to use it and to actually to offset or to minimize CO2 impacts. So I think I mentioned the energy sector. We have a big issue with the transport emissions, as in many other countries. So this is the biggest challenge. Agriculture seems to be also quite at the core of our actually strategic approach. Buildings, I think buildings is one of the key sectors that would be offsetting emissions, in my view, not only because of green roofs, but because of quality of materials, that building will be basically creating new energy for itself. Not even using solar panels, I think. So it will be self-generating unit, and I guess through this we will be going very down with the emissions. But 2050, it's maybe too far. We will now know more from our work from the World Bank that we are undergoing. By September, we will have a launch of the low carbon study, and it will focus on 2030, but it will provide outlooks for 2050. So let's see what the study shows, but I would remain optimistic.
Well, for 30 years ago, it's not a long time, I believe. So if we want to have a trees, we should start now. Anyway, Klaus, do you want to?
Yeah, as I mentioned already, I mean, we are going along the road, and our goal is to be close to zero in 2015 or further on, but we need the technologies first. Yeah? So if we get the technologies, we can go to zero whenever it happens. But we know that it will not go overnight. It's a long-term goal, and our industry is committed to that. But also we talk a lot now about long-term. There's also a short-term and a mid-term. And if we talk about the mid-term, and there's a new, let's say, trading mechanism in place from 2020 onwards, where there is a trading scheme implemented which affects the cement industry. We have to say also we have to stay in the game and we have to stay competitive, because we have neighboring countries. They don't underlie all these mechanisms. They don't have the targets, and cement is a product which is traded globally. We face imports here from Turkey. We face imports from Ukraine, and these countries have no climate target, have no fee on CO2 emissions, and we have to understand and we have to implement a mechanism which makes us staying in the game and that we stay competitive. And here we need a challenge, and also what we see now, the rules and regulations set out from 2020 and 2030 are bringing us a lot under pressure, and the risk is that the industry will go to neighboring countries where these regulations are not in place.
Thank you. Lukáš, does bank sector considers its future as a zero carbon, or is it too detached from money?
Well, definitely not for us. I mean, unfortunately, we don't think in those long terms in terms of our own strategy. But we actually do have a new one for Slovak Republic that was approved by our shareholders just late 2017, where we identified two key priorities for the bank and delivery of its mandate. And one of those is supporting Slovakia in its transition to green economy. So we are really committed and we are prepared to help the Slovak Republic, working with all stakeholders, private and public, to make that happen.
Thank you. That sounds encouraging. We have 10 minutes left, so if there are any questions from the floor, we can take some, 1, 2. If not, good, we exhausted you with our discussion. I would like to ask panelists maybe to say some closing remark, what you take from this discussion, and if there is still something you wanted to share with us and you weren't allowed or there was no room, so now this is the time. We may start with Klaus now.
Yes, thank you, and I will take the opportunity also of the presence of Arthur to just continue on my words, what I was saying before, and to go a bit more into detail, because what are the challenges of our industry, of the cement industry now, and what we see from 2020 on. There is a principle in the emission trading system which is called the leakage mechanism, which is a very good one, because this is taking care of what I explained, that we have to stay competitive. And the leakage mechanism is allocation of free certificates to the cement industry to stay competitive against imports. But there is a new definition of allocation of these certificates from 2020 on. First of all, the allocation is based on historical production data. We don't know when it is, but it was in the past, and it was, for example, 2015, 2016, but in 2020, 2021, we might have higher production volumes, so this allocation are not anymore representing the actual production level and the need for the industry. Also, this allocated free certificates are subject to a coefficient which is defined by the best in class. So the best 10 cement producers are taken, and their CO2 emissions are taken as a kind of benchmark for the allocated certificates. The problem is these 10 cement plants which were chosen as being a benchmark are best in class because they have local advantages, like they have a steel plant aside and they can source cheap slag, yeah? Or they have a lot of biomass and so on. Yeah? So our industry is very much dependent on where the location is, and industries not having these advantages are punished double. First, allocation to historical data. Second, by being benchmarked to best in class where they don't have the possibility to develop their production to that excellence like others have because of their location. And furthermore, these allocated certificates are reduced every year, starting from 2020 on, by 2.5%. This means this, along with the increasing CO2 price, with a reduction on free allocation of certificates, will lead to a high cost component in the cement industry. Okay, we can say, okay, we add this price to the cement price like the electricity industry is doing it. The electricity industry, they have no free certificates, they just add the costs to the energy price, and all of us are paying it, which is okay, because all of us have to contribute. Yeah? But in the cement, but the electricity has no imports. Yeah? We have the imports, as I mentioned, from Ukraine, from Turkey, and these don't have all this burden on costs, and we have to stay competitive, and this is a big danger for our industry if we are 3 times punished here. And another detail along with that, we have also different products. We are producing here in Slovakia white cement. White cement has a higher CO2 emission level than grey cement because of its nature of raw materials. But also we get free allocation which are benchmarked to the grey cement, but we have almost double. Yeah? So this is also something we have to balance out. And if I hear that the discussion is now ongoing, that CO2 should have a floor price, a minimum price, I think I don't understand the logic, because the CO2 should be at least subject to free trade mechanisms. And this is my request. That this has to be reconsidered, and we need to take care of the industry, which is a large macroeconomic component in all our countries we work with. We create GDP, we give jobs, we provide the local construction industry with materials, we take care of developing our countries, our cities.
Oh, thank you, Klaus. I hope this was heard of. Lukáš, may I ask your contribution, your summary of your feelings from the panel?
Well, I would of course like to thank the organizers for the opportunity to be here, and I would maybe use the opportunity to say last few words just to react to carbon leakage and the issue of EU being competitive versus countries where the companies don't need to adhere to all the tight regulations. I think one way to deal with this, and I would maybe ask our finance colleagues from other banks, is to use the same standards of financing in EU and outside EU. We as a bank, where most of our region that we operate in is outside EU, we use exactly the same standards that we ask our clients to comply with, whether it's finance risk or whether it's the green elements of their investments. And I think that's one way how to address this, and it's also a way how to bring these outside EU countries to the standard where we want to see EU.
Yes, this is not only the goal of finance sector, I believe, but we all need the improvement in technologies also outside the EU. Arthur, may I ask you now?
No, I should definitely say that climate policy in Europe is not there in order to drive industry out of Europe. That is not the purpose, because that would be self-defeating. If the standards outside Europe are lower, it would mean that industry would even have more emissions outside Europe. So in that way, you are not going to battle climate change. So this is an issue that we take very serious. And that is why we spend a lot of time to talk to our partners in order to push them forward. That was the reason that we moved into the Paris Agreement. But it is very clear that everybody will have to deliver in terms of implementation. And we have to be not naive as Europeans. We have to look and have a very critical eye on what is happening around us in the world. And we do that. We monitor the situation in terms of implementation. And I don't think I mentioned that we are marching forward like an army or a Roman army, step by step every year in order to fulfill what we are saying. We don't see that everywhere in the world happening. So we have to take that serious. And therefore, the issue of climate change is always on the agenda of the foreign ministries. And our embassies in the regions are active on looking what is happening there to make sure that this goes into the right direction. On the issue of the competitiveness, what's going to happen after 2020, again, this is something we will have to watch very carefully, whether the safeguards that have been put into the emissions trading, and one of those is the free allocation, are really going to get to the result that is required. So that is under constant monitoring. And if it would start not working any longer, we will have to think of additional measures in that context. And of course, in the case of the cement industry, it's particularly what is happening in North Africa, it's particularly what is happening in Turkey, is what is happening in the Ukraine. Because these are the competitors close by where we have to be very watchful on what goes on there.
Thank you. And Norbert, can you give us last remarks from your side?
Yeah, so on our behalf, or on my behalf, I would say that climate policy creates opportunities that we need to seize to the greatest extent possible. It's also fair to say that there will be very likely some losers, and they need to adapt to the new realities. Number three, that also climate or environmental policy creates competitive advantage in the context of industrial revolution. And this competitive advantage could be then further exported to the countries perhaps that are not so quick in the beginning. So let's start implementations, let's synergize, let's maximize also the benefits from the financing that is around. I think in full honesty, Slovakia did not perhaps use to the best way the financing that is available. Perhaps we could be even more active on the global scene because we are not recipient country anymore. We have to act like donors, but still we need to make our things right in Slovakia, and then we would be ready to export our ideas and knowledge.
Thank you very much. This brings us to the end of the session, and I would also like to say a few remarks. I know that we are very close to the end of the session, so just a couple of ideas I consider interesting from this session. First is linking the security and climate change is timely. I think it was mentioned by Artur or someone. And also the fact that this panel is part of the GlobSec, which is about the global security, I think is a good sign that we are thinking out of the silos, that climate change is environmental issue. I believe this is not the case in Slovakia, but it started like that a couple of years ago. Some other interesting point is that the climate change and low carbon future cannot go without the green economy and transition to the green economy and vice versa. That these are, I think Norbert mentioned that these are the same basically. And we have to bear it in mind when preparing all kind of strategies, whether it's environmental strategy, whether it is development strategy, sustainable development, whether it is even some local strategies, whether in municipalities or industries. These two goes together. Another interesting point, and I think we should bear in mind, is that these processes and developments have their implication on business and industry. Well, technology is not behaving in this panel. And we have to bear in mind that economic implications on economy and competitiveness of industry and business should be reflected when preparing a new regulation. And when we talk about the regulation, stability of regulatory framework is also one of the issues which were mentioned, and especially in terms of biofuels, but I think this is true for other policies and measures as well. And when it comes to finance, it seems that money are there, but we need to use them more efficient, and that I also could say that bank sector is ready to or is open to innovative ways of financing, but also to finance innovative ways of doing business, hopefully. With that, I would like to close this panel, but before leaving for the lunch, let me give you some organizational remarks. Lunch will be served both in the foyer and in the hotel restaurant. But please, I would like to remind you to be back in your seats at 1:30 for the next session on building skills in the age of artificial intelligence. The program in Danube Space outside continues at the same time with the discussion on achieving stability in the Middle East, and in Maria Theresia on the first floor with discussion on populism. So you are welcome on any of these events. Thank you very much, and have a nice lunch.